is a speaker series that is brought to you from the business program here at Fletcher. And what we do is we bring together leaders from across business and the innovation world to share their insights and engage with the Fletcher and the Tufts community. And today we're super excited to be hearing from and bringing you Dave Young at BCG, who's going to talk about optimizing for business and social value, but he's also going to be talking obviously about what's happening and what is the role of the private sector when it comes to the pandemic. So before I turn it over to Ben Noel from the Fletcher Consulting Club, he's going to say a few words. I'm going to just ask you, keep yourself please muted throughout the session. We're going to probably go for about 20 minutes. With some more formal remarks, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. We have our Dean of Global Business, Bhaskar Chakravorti, who's going to be moderating the Q&A section. The chat function is also enabled, so we encourage you though to stay focused on our guest speaker and use it primarily during the Q&A portion. I'll be taking your questions from the chat line, and Dean Bhaskar will also be taking your questions from the electronic hand raise. So without further ado, Ben, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Dorothy. So each semester, the Fletcher Consulting Group endeavors to bring leaders in their field into the Fletcher community for insights and to stimulate conversation. So this semester, we've worked with conjunction with the IBGC and are pleased to welcome our moderator, Dean of Global Business, founding executive director of the Institute for Business and Global Context, friend and colleague of our speaker today, David Young, Bhaskar Chakravorti.
Can everyone hear me? Excellent. So great to see all of your faces. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy, and people around you are doing the same. And if you just sit still for 14 days, you will make a huge difference. Probably one of the greatest impact you can have in the world. So just do that. Gives all of us great pleasure to assemble here, particularly to welcome Dave Young back to Fletcher in a somewhat different form. And Dave is an old friend and an old friend of Fletcher. And Dave is also even without going to Fletcher, is perhaps one of the most Fletchery people I've met in the consulting business. Dave is a senior partner at Boston Consulting Group, and he has had a pretty interesting trajectory within BCG and even outside the bounds of BCG. He spent, I believe, about 17 years at BCG, and then decided back in 2006 to get off the plane and get on a different plane and join World Vision International. And there he was the COO of World Vision International and worked on a number of issues to do with global relief and development and microfinance and advocacy, working with children and families and communities overcome with extreme poverty and injustice. He brought his on-the-ground experience and operational experience back to BCG, and now is the leader of BCG's social impact work. And in private conversations with Dave, he also has spoken about some tremendous innovations that he has started within the firm. Specifically, every study at BCG now does some kind of an evaluation of the ESG impact of those studies, which I just thought was fascinating. So I'm sure there are many things that Dave would like to share with us over the course of his experiences at the firm and what it is doing, but we will not have the time to cover it all because we've given Dave a very short capsule of time. So he'll hit the high points. He'll also obviously touch on what is going on in relation to our global response and BCG's response and corporate response to COVID-19. So I'm not going to take up any more time. Dave Young, Senior Managing Partner at Boston Consulting Group. Welcome.
Thank you, Bhaskar. It's a real joy to be with all of you. As As Bhaskar says, I have huge admiration for the program at Fletcher, and particularly for all those who have chosen to join into it in order to think about these connections in our ever more closely connected world between business, government, social sector, and capital. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to take about 20 minutes to just give you a perspective, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Let's see how our technology works here. Can you all see the screen? Excellent. Good. Thank you so much for that. Good. So I want to share some perspectives with you on what we think it's going to take to win in business in the 20s. And as we enter a new decade, we believe we are approaching and are entering a real tipping point for business, with new benchmarks for what it means to be a good company, a good investment, and a good leader. And the defining expectation is going to be that good companies and good investments deliver competitive financial returns while also helping society meet its biggest challenges. And in so doing, will enable sustainable business going forward. And when I wrote about this last year, that we were going to be tipping into a new era of business, I hardly envisioned the 20s were going to be starting off this way. As we not only tip into a new era, but we also tip into COVID. And of course, the impacts of this are cascading everywhere right now. And we can keep up to date every morning when we're greeted by the New York Times map. It's just giving us a sense of the pace at which this historic event is creating an impact around the globe. There's no question, right, that this is revealing the underlying capacity that we have, the resilience, the character of governments and companies and economies. It's a very vicious test of just how well prepared we were for this pandemic, but also how we are prepared as businesses, as governments, as investors to deal with an issue like this. And it doesn't really matter sort of who you are, what industry you're in. Everybody is wrestling right now almost simultaneously with the same challenge. And we're all on this very difficult journey of sort of managing through the crisis to minimize disruption, to get ready for recovery, to position for the future. It's all consuming, no matter what company, organization, or institution you talk with. The senior team is entirely preoccupied with how it executes on an agenda to protect employee health and safety, to shore up the business and reinforce business strength where possible, and to build the resilience financially that it will take to get through this crisis. And at the center of the agenda, in all cases, are really people. Starting with, how do we protect the health of employees? How do we think about that in terms of accelerating smart work practices, expanding programs that keep the employee and their family protected, whether they're at work or at home, dealing with workforce readiness issues, mitigating the risk you have to the organization through losing key people, or dealing with restrictions on workforce activity, and then managing the flexibility of the workforce, as every company now has suddenly entered the matrix, the virtual world of work in many ways. And then through this time, trying to make sure that there is a lot of communication and a supportive culture for employees as they find themselves in very different and sometimes very difficult situations. And the challenge for the leader is to communicate openly and with great empathy, and the solidarity to sort of stand together. Now, progressive companies are doing more, right? We find that in addition to thinking about the health and safety of the team, business strength, financial resilience, and driving that agenda as thoroughly and completely as they can, they are also thinking about the societal impact that they can create through the sum of the business today. And that is whether it's mitigating the spread through protecting those who are interfacing with the company, whether they be customers or distributors or suppliers, to supporting medical system needs wherever possible. And you've seen this recently of people putting out masks, PPE and others items into the health system, to leveraging the full value chain of the company to help meet supply gaps and community needs, whether it's from food to logistics to other services and technology, to pushing for the financial resilience of employees and communities, to helping for those nonprofits and social safety net organizations sort of bridge the gap. You know, this thinking is explicitly about the contributions that the company can make beyond the boundary of the company is a skill, certainly for a time of COVID, but it's also a skill that'll serve companies well tomorrow. And we believe that to be the case because the societal context for business is changing rapidly. Certainly, COVID has jump-started it a great deal, but there's also other trends that have been in place for some time. And we believe this is setting up a very different dynamic for business. And it doesn't matter where in the world you are right now, these same trends are taking hold. Companies will face escalating social activism by investors, stakeholders, social mission organizations, and policymakers on issues of climate risk, economic inequality, societal well-being. You'll see that that has escalated certainly everywhere with a shared sense of urgency to mitigate climate change impacts, leading to governments, whether they be national, state, or local governments, putting higher bars on the rights to operate for businesses. And the combination of that driving a radical attention to a company's environmental, social, and governance performance. Local performance today on these issues will quickly affect a company's global reputation. And so the stakes are higher. And consequently, we see investors then paying a lot of attention to this and beginning to integrate ESG factors into all aspects of their investment decision-making, but also into how they skew capital. It is shifting the investors' perceptions of a company's risk and opportunity, and that's going to affect the decision-making on where that capital goes and how they structure it. There's no question that all of you, certainly, and almost everyone I know, seeks to have great purpose in what they do with their time, their work, their resources. And that's the same with companies. So you would have seen that Larry Fink some years ago called out the importance of companies to have a clear, strong, powerful purpose. I think we know that companies that can articulate that purpose well, that have it in their brands, are more attractive to talent and hold that talent better. And that all of us, I think, have an aspiration, and increasingly so, to make sure that the products we're purchasing, the services we're using, are doing good. So good products doing good is becoming the norm for what's going on. And because of the challenge of making that happen, it's requiring the companies to work together in collective action to take on some challenges that are shared across the industry, whether that is closing the recycling system in a way that can create circular economies around things, whether it's getting together to deal with issues like plastics or obviously GHG emissions. We're seeing new forms for collective action going forward. And of course, as Fletcher folks, you're obviously deeply aware and committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, and these externalities, these shared challenges that we all face are part of what it's going to take for us to achieve these things together, or as companies and investors or governments risk the social and political permission for further progress. And while some question these, we're entering the 5-year period now, and some question the breadth and the timeline, most would agree that if we achieve this, we could create a much more just and inclusive and sustainable world. And of course, Goal 17 calls us to partner across sectors, public, private, social, capital, for collective action to achieve the goals. So we're almost 5 years into this agenda. There's ample evidence that governments, investors, and companies are beginning to exercise their capacity to create that much needed change, but obviously more needs to be done. So I want you to just kind of put all this together in a blend that says, now we must operate our companies and our investments and our business processes, our employment processes in this rapidly changing context. And it goes further, right? If we look at the impacts of natural disasters and the extremes brought about by climate change, you know, there's over $2 trillion, $2.5 trillion here in the last 10 years, thanks to climate risk and a wide range of natural disasters. So clearly the private sector can be an important partner along with government and the social sector in reducing the risks, in preventing disasters and doing recovery and response. Today with COVID-19, everyone is figuring out the role that they can play in helping society meet this response. And so the consequences of this, if you will, this gestalt, is that it's forcing this wider aperture for business. Well beyond, I think, what Milton Friedman saw with a view that equated sort of social responsibility to generating profits. And unlike the company pictured on the left here that would advertise that each day they can melt 7 million tons of glacier, I'm not sure any of us would race out to advertise our ability to melt 7 million tons of glacier right now. The effort is much more to show the seriousness and resolve as businesses and investors that we want to participate in mitigation and solutions to all of this and sort of be on the side of where society is going. No surprise then, right, that all these pressures have prompted CEOs of the U.S. Business Roundtable to issue a public notice that the time has come to complement a shareholder perspective with a stakeholder perspective. Regardless of how ambitious you thought the statement was that came out from the BRT, there was clearly a shift in saying it is now time to put attention on all these other groups within our corporate capitalist model that we have come along. And so CEOs, those pictured here, and pretty much any CEO I know right now, are feeling the pressure to understand and tackle the environmental and societal challenges that are created by their industry or by their company. And in some cases, you know, these impacts are profound. If we take a look at this example, this is consumer goods companies. You know, 24% of global CO2 emissions in 2017 was originated by consumer companies, 25% of illegal deforestation, 58% of the population, right, is being fed with products that one could argue may be contributing to underlying health issues or obesity. The top 5 food and beverage companies consume 600 billion liters of water, right, which is as much water as the potable water demands of all individuals on the planet today. And 36% of global plastic waste is coming from consumer products, and 30% of food produced within our food systems today actually goes to waste, while we have over 800 million malnourished. So clearly we have a systems issue in facing our industries. We have a systems issue in looking at our business models today. And while the scrutiny on the environmental and social impacts of business increases, you know, companies and investors are finding more and more data that talks about the economic opportunities for companies that become part of the solution in products and services and talent, acquisition and investor performance. And that the more we get this data, the more we can develop the courage that we don't have to make a trade-off between the things we do as investors or companies and what we need to do as a society and a planet. And the analytical data, and I think you folks have been part of some of this. We did some seminal work years back on this that showed there is a positive connection between overperformance on environmental social governance factors and being able to see things like lower cost of capital, better operating performance, and a positive influence on stock price. Asset managers, right, are pursuing sustainable investment strategies. As a result, they look at the data and say, wait a second, you know, I now have a better line of sight into hidden risks and also into potential opportunities. So consequently, they're paying a lot of attention to how they steer their portfolios. And whether it's a global investor like BlackRock or it's the head of Amundi, they see a way now to integrate in these non-financial indicators into how they're thinking about the underlying quality of the investments that they make. And certainly you're all very familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is pushing for the disclosure of underlying assets, the carbon risk that they have under various scenarios. All of these investors are keenly aware of that. And as a result, not only are they steering capital in traditional products more and more, but they're also offering new products, new funds, and they're factoring that into how they engage with their customers, how they promote management attention of those underlying assets onto these measures. And in some cases, and you would have seen in the Wall Street Journal recently, an article about how the corporate activists are now positioning themselves to take advantage of the attention on these measures and are beginning to become activists around ESG factors. And so if I'm a company, it's no surprise why I would be very eager to introduce a series of targets that say, what am I going to do to become more environmentally responsible? What are the things I'm going to do to expand the social impacts that I create to broaden my license to operate? What am I going to do to show my ethical content in what I do and how I do it as a company? So if you look at this example here, this is from the mining and metal spaces. You know, everybody, whether they're focusing on GHG emissions or water security or waste or resource use or biodiversity risk, are trying to illustrate that they are committed to perform to a new level of expectation so that they can be among the group of good companies that are also doing good. And if you think about the underlying business models for many of those companies against the issues that they're targeting, it will require very much a restructuring and rethinking of how business has been traditionally done. Now, the good news is that when they get in and begin to do this work in detail, they can discover that there are benefits. And so it can be shown statistically in calculating against the norms, correcting for all other factors, that margins can expand by doing things that are smart for the environment. They can be rewarded in valuations. That gives you, again, additional courage that you don't have to make a trade-off, but you can do both. And if we think about this as in previous eras, transformative eras for business, it will take a shift in the managerial mindset to really unlock new ways of winning, new ways of competing, new ways of doing business. This takes a fundamental rewiring of the managerial imagination and decision-making, underpinned by an equation for corporate value that goes beyond delivering a predictable P&L and a steady dividend stream. So, and the starting point is to sort of instill this really inspiring sense of purpose into the corporation that captures the broader ambition of the business beyond profit and gives employees meaning in their daily work and a line of sight to how their work actually makes the world better. And that requires the leaders reorientate their thinking, beginning with their ambition to improve what we would call the total societal impact and sustainability of the company while meeting shareholder goals, and doing it by improving the economic, environmental, and societal impacts the company creates through products, through its services, through what it does as a business, and how it does it. That requires setting an agenda that explicitly connects the programs and initiatives around the societal impact and sustainability to the value drivers of the business, to what drives financial value, so that they have a new engine for shareholders and society. And when it's done well, the data says, of course, valuations can expand for those who are outperforming on those dimensions, just like those who outperform financially. If you're going to do that, it requires that those way of thinking and the programs and initiatives have to be fully encoded into the strategy of the business, to the business models that are undertaken, to the value chains and the way they work, to the products and services that are done. So it's actually weaving it together in a very tight way, no longer thinking about these as separate activities or just discretionary byproducts, but thinking them very much as new DNA for the corporation. And the starting point is to move from thinking about the hard side of business and sustainability as separate activities, but rather to join these things up so that you see strategy and operating models at the intersection of shareholder value, social impact, sustainability, and corporate longevity. The challenge must be to have the test on the quality of strategy and business models is whether it is simultaneously delivering on all three of these things for a good strategy and a good business. And if you're thinking that way, if you're oriented that way, if that's what you're doing, you're moving from sort of seeing this as a reporting challenge to seeing it as building for sustainable business model innovation. So it pushes the company from seeing and reporting these societal dividends as stuff that's derived from CSR, or demonstrating compliance, or being reactive and scattershot in how particular sustainability challenges are met, to actually looking for building fundamentally new ways to compete that co-optimize for business and social benefit. It also means thinking about the societal impacts that the company can create much more broadly than simply the economic or environmental. And we talk about sort of 6 dimensions of this, and therefore it's important that you open your mind to all the dimensions of common good that the company or the investment can create, beyond economic vitality and value. Things that are meaningful inside the company, as each of these dimensions are, and out. So environmental sustainability is certainly among the most visible things that goes on, but also lifetime well-being, which is in how the life of people is enriched, certainly with wellness, but beyond that, of wellness and health, but also into wholeness and dignity and activity and mobility. Ethical capacity is about how the company or the investment adds to the ethical strength of society, creating transparency, corruption proofing, preventing misuse. Societal enablement is about how the company enables society to function more effectively. For an example, social media and platforms that are enabling and providing not just the needs for information, but for interaction, as we're all discovering. And then very importantly, access and inclusion in how the company expands reach to enable the marginalized and excluded to become integrated into the products, services, the availability to the others, for example. Financial inclusion, bringing the unbanked into the financial system is a good example. Such a wide perspective of social value can stimulate creativity and innovation for the business and also for investors, for business and for the common good. Now, to get there, one has to think very carefully about what's important to the stakeholders and to the business. So the first step is to assess materiality. And by materiality, we mean those things that are considered important to stakeholders and those things that are important to the business going forward. The second step is a very detailed one of taking apart the value chain of the business ecosystem and understanding where social value, all those 6 dimensions of value, which are the colors that are illustrated in this chart, are being created, or how could they be created. and then to take a look at products and processes and services and try to grow their footprint of societal value through innovation. And so the spider on the right side of that page is mapping out a specific example where a company tried to improve the overall quality of its social and environmental contribution in the products that it was offering. Moving beyond that then, as you begin to think about that, and you say, okay, I want to create these impacts, these are my ambitions, then I'm faced with the reality that these things can be very difficult to do. And so in some cases, you can want to reduce your water, your waste, your CO2 emissions, but you need to put that investment first and wrestle with solutions, maybe before they pay off, or different materials, which now affect everything from not just design, but through the production process, sustainable ingredients or end producer responsibilities in order to be able to fully transmit the social value you've created to the store shelf or into the company's business. That poses real challenges around business models, around product design, and therefore what does require? Innovation. And so this is very good for us. These constraints of having to do more things means we begin reconceptualizing the way we're running business and the way we have done products, and forces us to press hard on innovation. Now the good news is this is happening. And when we look around the world, we see types of sustainable business model innovation, topologies, if you will. When we find 7 of these, own the origin by capturing and differentiating the social value of inputs to production processes, products, or services. So for example, those inputs that are produced with cleaner energy or sustainable sourcing practices or preserving biodiversity or recycled content or empowering work practices. That type of advantage often requires advancing the performance of the supply base, the stewardship of resources, communities, and trade flows. And so a lot of rethinking there. Owning the whole cycle is then seeing your product as part of a circular economy, and how can you make that happen, often by rethinking how you've thought about integration, both backward integration and forward integration, but also your involvement in the bigger ecosystem to make it possible. A third model is about expanding the societal content of the product or service itself. And you saw that in the previous picture of the spider chart, where you explicitly tried to grow the lifetime value, lifetime wellness of the product, where you've tried to expand its ethical content, or access and inclusion around it. So how do you do that? Expanding the chains, and in this case, thinking about how you press even further, layering your value chain onto another company's value chain in order to extend the reach and benefits of the products that you're bringing, the services that you're offering. We're going backwards again with suppliers as well, and being able to cascade benefits through the value chains. A real push to relocalize or regionalize global supply chains in order to bring closer to home the benefits of whether it's the economic benefits or whether the employment or people's ability to see the sourcing happening nearby, and even the nature of the product itself to be more in tune with the capacities of those communities and countries to the benefits and the culture. And I think we'll see, as a result of COVID as well, a recognition that in some cases our optimization for global supply chains efficiencies have come at the expense of a brittleness and often a disconnectedness from where other value can be created. Energizing the brand through doing this, where you begin to pull these things together and then offer consumers and companies the ability to get a hold of a product that has encoded this greater societal impact in it. You would have seen that P&G announced that it was reinventing brand management, where it was going to take its 20 leadership brands and make sustainability irresistible. So the brand itself is carrying with it the ethos and the value of more sustainability. And then building cross-sector, where we see companies engaging with governments and nonprofits in hybrid models that allow both the expansion of the business and its economic benefits, but together the expansion of societal and environmental benefits. And you'll find models now where you've had companies like Royal DSM partnering with a USAID and CARE to drive enhanced micronutrient fortification through products in East Africa to improve both the economic outcomes that are there for farmers who are supplying grains into that operation, but also to improve nutritional security and well-being. So these 7 business transformations, if you will, become a way to think differently about the business models that the company has now. To do that takes an innovation process. And so we talk about sustainable business model innovation in a cycle to do this that begins with a stress test of the business model against its sustainability and social impact today. That's happened much quicker than anybody thought with the advent of COVID-19. And the way to think about that stress test, other than in a pandemic period, is to expand the context of the business, to look at the entire ecosystem that includes the societal challenges in a particular market or more broadly in the ecosystem, to extrapolate environmental and societal trends, the ones we talked about, the 8 trends at the beginning, and say what would be the impact of those trends on the business, to think about materiality scenarios where you're layering the things that are important to stakeholders in the company, you're putting those on top of one another and you're running those forward and saying, how does my business survive in that type of an environment with this change in government policy, with this change in investor attention, with this change in the ecosystem that wants to be more carbon neutral? How do I survive when my business needs to scale in multiples? As for instance, I want to move out of plastic packaging, but discover that only a small portion of my packaging demands exhaust the entire supply of recycled PET in order to make the package in the first place. That scaling creates a new challenge around innovation. So first, discover the breakpoints in the system and its limitations in creating environmental and social value. And then those 7 business model transformations we talked about, you begin to layer those transformations into the business and say, okay, what are the ways I can take this business and to begin to own the origins? How can I move forward here with change? What does that mean? Does it make my business stronger? Am I more sustainable? Do I have more societal impact? And this becomes an iterative process between that kind of innovation and then testing it with the value drivers. So here's that step that is this explicit linkage between what I'm accomplishing in terms of environmental and social impact and what and how that links to value drivers of the business that actually assures that I can deliver to the expectation of my share owners, but that I also have the capital necessary to invest at rates needed to drive this sustainable business model transformation. And so I continue this loop between the innovation and the linkage to value drivers until I have an equation that I'm excited about, at which point I work to tune the way I capture value from that system now. I refine it by geography because the way it plays out in Indonesia or India will be different than in Brazil or North America. I collaborate in collective action for system-level changes to produce the environment in which I can go ahead and realize that new business model. So for instance, I become quite the activist around helping government think more clearly about recycling systems and the incentives necessary if I am committed as one of my actions to a circular economy model. This process then, as we move into the 20s, is one that can't stop, but we have to keep cycling over and over. And so that's very much a journey, right? A journey that starts with understanding the current state, of setting a bold vision and ambition mapped to the purpose and values of the company, and understanding what's really important to the stakeholders, as we've discussed, to looking at strategy and creating those changes to do that business model innovation, to have some lighthouse projects that become a signpost for the business or for that investment on how things are going to look tomorrow. And then to understand, how do I capture value in a way that allows me to have this process of constant reinvestment in doing sustainable business model transformation. And that is things from gaining share to redefining the envelope under which I extract profit. And then how do I operationalize the impact? And this is taking all the tricks, right? Innovation sprints that can very rapidly begin to step up the social content of products and services. It's fast rollout so that you learn by doing. It is creating partnerships with, in some cases, other companies, often with non-governmental organizations or social sector organizations. It's about enabling the organization, figuring out a different model to accelerate impact, and then very much so engaging with investors and stakeholders accordingly. There are a series of factors needed to do this, but obviously the most important is the strength and vision of the board and the CEO and that leadership. But then putting in place, just as in any of your coursework, as you begin thinking about what it takes to operationalize things, whether it's those strategic direction and activities, and strong business cases, or making sure that you have the right goals and measurements, and you're putting in place the right organization and responsibilities to implement what is fundamentally a changing business as a result. Now, there is a bigger picture as I wrap up here. Let's consider what happens when many businesses and institutional investors expand their perspective and sense of purpose, right? They become really important forces in helping a nation and the world achieve the sustainable development goals. When a leader puts themselves at the center of shareholder value, social value, and sustainability, and corporate longevity, they can create social impact for the common good. When they partner then with the public sector and the social sector, they create new models of collaboration, and they're positioned for either even larger environmental and social impacts and system changes. And when investors mobilize capital toward those companies and into those new models, they have the resource to scale for sustainable development goal outcomes. So these changes at the corporate level and these changes in the minds of institutional investors and the bias of their capital can have a repurposing effect for our corporate capitalism so that we have a better prospect of achieving the SDGs. The overall, as I wrap up, just a few messages. The overall societal context for business has changed. The model of companies as economic islands that independently maximize financial value extraction is becoming obsolete. And companies and investors now need to co-optimize for financial and social value to secure the resilience necessary to have durable competitive advantages going forward. The leaders that are pursuing this are going to leave a legacy of not only a better company and better shareholder returns, but also of a better society and a better planet. And as you move through your coursework and you think about the way these big forces are coming together to reshape business, to reshape investment, it's an opportunity for you as you move forward in your career to be part of something that truly is extraordinary in our ability to create an impact in achieving the SDGs and having a more just and fair future for all. Thanks very much. Let me stop there and open it up for your questions.
So, thank you, Dave, for that very illuminating overview of this process that we have been on, that you describe as tipping into a new era for business societal impact and business value. And as you rightly pointed out, corporations, big or small, cannot afford to remain economic islands, and they need to also design for resilience. And this is indeed a test of leadership. So thank you for sharing your perspectives and for some fairly specific models of business transformation. I thought the 7 models you talked about are very interesting to reflect on. If I could just sort of kick off with one question. I have so many on my mind, but I'm just going to ask one question, then we'll open this up to the floor. My first question for you and for all of us to consider is everything you mentioned, all the graphs about the coincidence between long-term value and paying attention to ESG issues and the SDGs. They have been with us for many years.
That's right.
Business has largely been, paying lip service to them, and more recently they've been playing catch up. And yes, the CEO roundtable has signed on to serving stakeholders rather than shareholders. Now, we were hoping that this trend was going to begin to accelerate, and then we got hit by COVID.
Yeah.
I guess one question is, how do you and your colleagues, as you're talking to your clients and you walk from client to client, ask the question, for which of these clients is life after COVID going to mean an acceleration of that process towards ESG? For which clients is it actually going to be in the opposite direction, where they hunker down and say, can't afford this anymore, I'm in absolute crisis mode, I've got to show up for the shareholders. And then for a third category, which kind of says, this has completely changed all my assumptions, and I'm going to go in a totally new direction. So I'm wondering whether you have run into even distinct examples of clients who are thinking along those 3 lines at the very minimum.
Yeah, no, Bhaskar, it's a great question, because I think all of us felt this huge building momentum, right, as we were approaching the 20s, very much as you say, because it was unstoppable, right? You had simply too much capital there. You had too many companies there. Davos this year was very different than Davos last year and the year before in terms of the degree to which this got very, very specific. In the people that I'm speaking to now, and we'll see, right? This is sort of changing everything. 3 things. One is obviously everybody is trying to get through this experience as quickly and as effectively as they can. But there's something different going on here now, right? Then there was, let's take the crash, right? When it was a financial crash, did it have ripples everywhere and on everything? It did, but it was different. We weren't talking about the health of every person everywhere in a shared global experience happening all at once, with huge knock-ons into how work got done, how the responsibility I felt as a company to my employees, to my communities, to my government, calls being put on me for what was I going to do to deliver above and beyond. Right? And I think there's some characteristics of this experience which is causing leaders to, to think, obviously they have to get through this, right? I mean, boards are having sometimes weekly and bi-weekly phone calls with CEOs to understand how they're navigating through everything. But I do think you're finding a lot of reflection that's beginning to materialize, that it's going to be impossible for people to go back to work and work be just what it was before. I think people are connecting in different ways. I think they're thinking about what they do and how they do it as individuals and as companies. I think they all realize that we either get through this thing together or we're not going to get together and we're not going to come out of it in a healthy way. So I actually think in one sense, there's going to be an overall, for everybody, regardless of which of your 3 categories I fall in, a deep corporate reflection. I think by and large, the pressures for climate particularly the environmental risks, are not going away. If anything, they're only accelerating. So I believe that those companies that feel that they are up against it when it comes to scrutiny on their environmental footprint are going to, after this crisis, behave perhaps even more quickly than they did before, because of the attention capital continues to place and the amounts of capital that are getting on there. Interestingly enough, we have some major global private equity firms who have asked us to scan their portfolio to identify companies that need to be doing more on the social front and the environmental front going forward, because there's a perception that not doing that, not just not behaving well during COVID, but not positioning myself to sort of be this whole of a responsible corporation with respect to environment and society as a risk over time, and therefore I'm more protected. I think there is going to be a category of businesses that, because depending on how they're hit by this thing, right? If I'm not a consumer products company providing consumer staples, or I'm an online company, right? Or I'm an Amazon, I'm feeling this crisis in a very different way. I think you are going to have some companies in survival mode. And so discretionary activity is going to be very difficult for them to do. You have to have enough resource to engage in business model innovation. And if you're fighting for business survival, that will be more difficult to do. I think a challenge for firms like ours is that when we're working with companies, our ambition is to infuse everything we're doing with the good of the business, but also a deep look for how you bring to life common goods through the business, right? And so that when we have a team doing supply chain, whether it's a supply chain a year ago or a supply chain now or a supply chain 2 years from now, it's going to be asking itself questions about how do I fill out as many societal benefits as I can. So I don't think we know for sure, but I would say that I remain optimistic that by and large, the majority of businesses will find themselves after this with even more heightened awareness that they're connected to the common good in different ways than they may have thought before. I think that'll be particularly true for the CEO and for leadership.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dave. And I'll leave you with and everybody with a visual analogy that I find particularly compelling. Napoleon III, when he rebuilt Paris after the cholera outbreak, he built it with the wide boulevards so that the sunlight could come through. And the notion was that would help prevent the next pandemic from arriving and wiping us all out. I think pandemics have a way of really rebuilding the fundamental architecture of everything. And it'll be interesting to reflect on how the architecture of business and ESG and the role of business in society, how that's rebuilt, and whether we do build the wider boulevards and let the sunlight in. Let me open up, speaking of bringing the sunlight in.
Great analogy. Great analogy, Bhaskar.
Yeah, if you could raise your blue hand, those of you who have questions, we'll just go down the list. Your blue hand. Otherwise, we'll just cold call.
I can see names too. I can sort of scan the video here.
Yeah. Okay. So Coralie, is that you raised your real hand, but we'll take that.
Yeah, I couldn't find my blue hand. Hi. So thanks so much, David, Dorothy, Professor Bhaskar. It's nice to see you guys again. I'm actually joining you from Paris, and it is eerily quiet, but I have to say that the wide boulevards do make it a little bit more tolerable when you have the sunlight. So I wanted to ask you, it seems like a lot of the examples, the presentation was really interesting, especially in terms of the processes that we have to engage in order to achieve any type of SDG infused business case. however, they seem to be coming from a very endogenous point of view from a business. What I mean is that potentially a middle manager, or specifically a CEO or a higher executive, is going to take the project in hand in order to expand the business lines and the business case of the company. Now, what about companies, for example, that have a very exogenous reimagining? For example, the Fiat and Peugeot merger that happened earlier this year, as a direct result of CO2 emissions that they were and rightfully scared about their financial impacts. How do we approach those sorts of companies? And how do you approach this with would you approach this with a similar process?
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the, if you want to call them the models of whether they're mergers, acquisitions, spin-outs, changing of corporate forms, right, are tactics on the way to improving the quality of the business, irrespective. Well, what we would suggest is you do those for many of the same reasons. For instance, we were working with a conglomerate, right? So they had multiple divisions, and each of those divisions had different environmental and societal aspects to the lines of business that they were in. In this case, the CEO said, look, I just don't believe the shape of this conglomerate going forward, given the way the world's evolving, is going to make a lot of sense. I'm not sure we have as many opportunities by remaining focused in what we're doing today as we would if we began to think very differently about the world. So he actually engaged in a really comprehensive scan to understand all of the activities that were out to mitigate environmental and climate impacts. And once that was done, then identify specific companies that were more leading edge in doing that, and then took his portfolio and actually divested 2 really successful businesses right on that portfolio, and brought in these other companies, took the line of business that he retained and tuned up the parts of it that were focused on environmental services, and then sort of put the whole thing back together and took that portfolio in a matter of less than 18 months from something that maybe had 20% at the most that could be considered environmentally focused, and now it has over 80% of the portfolio in just that period of time. So I think in those kinds of examples, you're literally saying one future is kind of going opposite from all these forces, right? And simply taking me to more and more and more risk and less and less and less opportunity. I want to get positioned so that I'm on this side of embracing it. Same thing if you look at, you know, in the businesses that are connected to agriculture and the food system. You'll find many folks who are now saying, no, we got to get a hold of regenerative agricultural resources. In some cases, we have to invent new businesses to feed our demands that are largely based on regenerative agricultural practices. And either we'll do that through the farmers that are there, or we'll start buying farms and doing it at the scale that we need. So I think this is causing that full rewiring. I do think we also seen, of course, you know, being innovators and entrepreneurs out everywhere, people looking for the limits to certain industries and the problems those industries are creating, and discovering whole new ways of doing something. You might have seen an article recently, I think it might be there in France actually, of somebody who's experimenting with a whole different way to create cement that would radically reduce the energy demands in the cement. Same thing for aluminum. You would have seen a venture between Rio Tinto, Alcoa, and Apple to come up with a whole new process that basically radically reduces the amount of energy required to produce aluminum. So you're going to have the same, so in other words, the same tricks that business uses to do business, they just need to be reoriented around these challenges. to do it. And I think, I've also been encouraged to see, we have a digital ventures business, right? And so we work with clients. I think we've launched 104 new businesses, bringing our digital ventures team along with a client to create a new business that has sort of a digital backbone to it. Every one of those businesses is now being assessed when it's created, ground up to a full business on what it's doing and what its total societal impact contributions are. And then that unit is being measured at a portfolio level for those contributions. So you can imagine the energy that puts in to every sprint, every digital sprint that's done, to every business that stood up, to the decisions on management hiring, so that you're getting both to happen at the same time.
That's interesting.
Does that help?
Yeah, it does help. It's interesting. And I'll just take 3 seconds and say, in Paris, there is a BCG office. And do they have a focus on do they have a focus on societal impact and digital ventures as they do, I know, in Boston?
Yes. In fact, there was just you can find a report that was released for French industry that was done by our Paris office that was talking about these trends and was talking about what it meant going forward. So I know they would be very happy to speak with you, and you could poke around a little bit and you'll discover this this report that was done just last year to understand its impact. Also on the institutional investment space, right? Where we're seeing a lot of that as well with people like Amundi and others.
Great, thank you. I'll leave the floor to other people. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Coralie. Others? I thought I saw Vicky's hand. Vicky? Maybe you restart it?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mute.
Yes. Hi, I'm calling you from Trinidad and Tobago. I was interested to hear you talk about regenerative agriculture because that's the field that I'm in. But my question really—
Good for you, Vicky.
The statement that you made about making sustainability irresistible, which is a wonderful phrase, but I am wondering about what you said about companies pursuing system level changes and organizing collective action. And I really would like for you to expand on that. Trinidad and Tobago in particular is a oil and gas producing country. We don't see big systemic changes in fossil fuels, which of course we would like to see. And so how are you seeing these companies actually working together to organize this collective action that we really need to change the basic systemic structures? I mean, it's not going to be that easy to change accounting, to change corporate governance, even if you have these wonderful ideas about trying to become more inclusive and more environmentally sensitive and so on, because they try and they haven't been succeeding.
Yeah, Vicki, it's a terrific question, and kudos for you for being interested in regenerative agriculture as well. There is a layer of, there are limits to what any one company can accomplish, right? It can push itself as far along on being environmentally sustainable, on contributing more in terms of those social outcomes. But at some level, you bump into the ecosystem. And the changes actually have to happen at that level. And they are not going to happen by a single company. They have to happen through, as you point out, collective action. It was very interesting. I believe it was earlier this year where the Caribbean Beverage Association, right, recognized the challenges of perpetuating plastics through the beverage industry there, and actually formed a collective to take on this problem and say, what is the change that has to happen across the Caribbean in order for us to be able to move toward a circular economy where we no longer have plastics that are either going into the sea or into a landfill on any one of our islands. And so they actually came together and looked at the overall economics. They looked at the individual ecosystems. They looked at the collective ecosystem, and they figured out what needed to get changed in order to create the incentives and the infrastructure in order to facilitate that that ability. So then each player obviously still has to do all kinds of stuff themselves, right? They have to make changes in their process. They have to make changes in the way they think about packaging and its design. They have to think differently about transportation, lots of things. But they realized that unless they got together, they were never going to change the infrastructure to the degree that it needed. So that's kind of a concrete example. We're seeing it more quickly on things that have a strong consumer interface. I don't know if you're familiar with IBM's Food Trust platform, but the goal there is an example is through a blockchain implementation to provide full transparency of on a particular food product from origin to use, so that a consumer can actually know from that store shelf, scanning that code, right, where what's been attached to that product. I think when you begin to see platforms like that, becoming available to businesses, I think that's going to do things to accelerate because that transparency adds to the forces in the system, and that will push companies to work collectively. Part of that collective action, right, is also recognizing where corporations themselves have limits and where government is needed, and where social sector is needed. None of these systemic changes we're talking about can be handled by corporations alone. It does take this intersection of public-private social, which is why this Fletcher program is so incredibly important that you're taking on. In regenerative ag, I don't know if you're familiar with the Teraton initiative. It's actually, for those that are familiar with Boston, there's a company here called Indigo Agriculture, which is an agricultural biotech. But they have an effort called Teraton to basically sequester 1 trillion tons of carbon in soil by improving soil health, practicing regenerative agriculture, and setting up new markets that basically enable that. The byproduct, by the way, is that farming profitability increases significantly. You need less fertilizer, you need less water, you're growing crops that actually are in a higher demand because of their organic content. And so farm profitability and household farming sustainability increases, which are also doing this, phenomenal sync. So ag, is one of the golden keys here, and it's great that you're pursuing that out of an interest also. But that's an example too of where you're seeing collective action. You're seeing people that would, that need to achieve offsets more rapidly than they can. Really backing efforts to drive conversion of traditional ag lands to regenerative agricultural lands.
Well, thanks a lot. I know a little bit about that Caribbean Beverage Association, and it's hard. We can't seem to get the bottle bill through the Parliament. Some, but not all. Thank you very much, though.
Well, yeah, Vicki, it's great. Stay at it. It takes activism to push some of this stuff along.
Yeah, well, thank you, Vicki, and Dave, thank you so much for taking the time out of, I'm sure, a very busy day. We have run over, and I know that people have to run to their next Zoom calls. In fact, I have a Zoom call that's been waiting for 15 minutes.
Zooming away.
And I'm sure you've got alarms going off on yours as well. I just wanted to close with one comment that perhaps only I can make. So I'll just say that you look like a spitting image of Conan O'Brien on Zoom. So those of our participants who don't know you, you are so much more attractive than Conan O'Brien in real life. But I just wanted to put that.
Oh, always a flatter. I'll be back anytime, Bhaskar. Back anytime.
Yeah, but you were just as engaging and captivating as Conan. So Dave, thank you so much for illuminating us on where the future of business is. And we look forward to seeing you in real life very soon. But in the meantime, hopefully we can still have students reach out with any questions and follow up that they might have, because I'm sure there are lots of ideas and questions that will have come up from your very provocative talk. So
I'm very happy. I'm very happy for folks to reach out, and you know, give me a few days to get back to you, but I'll happily come back to you.
All right.
So I want to take a few moments just to give Dave a round of applause. I'm actually going to unmute you, so you're just going to hear a lot of great noise, but send him a lot of love, and we'll be back in touch. And go for it.
Thank you all.
Thank you. It's great to see you, Coralie.
Nice to see you too, Dorothy.
Thanks.
Everybody
for
stay safe.
Trying.
Yeah, stay safe and stay sane.
So
Bye-bye.
Coralie, you're
Bye-bye.
next to Nico. Nico, unmute yourself.
Howdy.
Howdy. So Nico, are you in France as well?
No, I'm in Minneapolis.
Oh, you're in Minneapolis, but he's originally from France.
I'm
Oh,
originally from
cool.
Greece, but I do have a French last name, so.
That's okay. We will take it, because I know you were in the Spanish business school as well.
Yeah.
So.
Great.
Thanks for
Okay.
joining us, Coralie. Are you still at Michelin?
Yeah, I'm still at Michelin, and today was a day of solidarity. So it's a day where you're not on vacation, but you're not paid. So it's a day of solidarity for the factory workers that didn't have essentially the vacation times that we do. So we put the day down so that they can benefit a little bit from it. So it's all good.
Well, thank you.
So Coralie, you have, if you're at Michelin, do you know about their clever system of leasing the truck tires so that they can manage the full life cycle of the truck tire?
Yeah, we have a couple of clever systems like that.
Yeah, no, it's actually I think it's one of the coolest examples